So the Economic Review Board has been meeting since September, and if we could go to the next slide, Maddie, thank you. We have a group of around about 12 commissioners from a wide variety, I think, of backgrounds. We try to make sure we've got a good balance in terms of diversity and in terms of different sectors and perspectives. And I think that's probably been worked quite well. I think people feel that we've had some really good discussions and debates. And I also think that all the people coming from their different backgrounds have felt that they've learned quite a lot by going through the process, which is actually quite an important lesson. And one of the recommendations might be to take more people through that kind of process, because actually the sharing of approaches and ideas and getting to know each other better is a really important part sometimes of this kind of work. But we also, as I mentioned, the commissioners don't have all of the expertise to answer all the difficult questions, nor are we experts on every single issue. So we decided that what we do is organise the review along the lines of a kind of parliamentary select committee. And if you know how they work, what they tend to do is you've got a select committee, and they bring expert witnesses in to talk about the things the committee wants to understand. There is some reading to do with that, but what they rely on is the question and answer process of talking to each other to try and arrive at some conclusions and some ideas about what needs to be done. And so we organised ourselves around these 5 sessions. So the first was a data session, and one of the chapters certainly in the final report will be on the data, because I think it's fair to say that we all felt we'd learned an awful lot just by actually realising some very, practical things about facts about the town and about how the labour market works, and how many people have got different kinds of skills, and how many business startups there are, and a whole range of other associated issues which are quite important in terms of helping us focus on the kind of key issues. So data was one of our sessions, and we've had lots of help from the Alliance Business School, which is part of the University of Manchester, and one of their team has been helping us as an advisor with our group, providing us with some really good data. And we've had great data as well from the local authority, which has been really, really helpful. But then the kind of sessions that we focused on were in terms of exploring the issues around the economy. Well, what's Oldham's relationship with the city region? How does that work? How could that work better? And what are the kind of challenges? We talked a lot about skills, particularly the importance of improving skills and skills levels in the town. And we also talked a lot about business, around businesses that are here and successful, but the fact that perhaps one of the characteristics of the town is that we have a very high degree of dependence on public sector employment, more than you would expect. And that is a challenge in terms of how we deal with that. And of course, that tends to mean that a lot of the kind of higher paid jobs are public sector jobs as opposed to private sector jobs. And there's a lot of quite complicated issues, obviously, to deal with around that. But we also were very keen to make sure that in looking at the economy, we didn't take that out of context of the other important things that are linked to what we've called in this social fabric. I think you will recognise, whether you use the same term or not, I think you'll recognise what we mean by that. So we mean, a whole range of voluntary and community activity that supports a good life. We mean amenities like Alexandra Park and the leisure centre. We mean the town centre, not just in terms of the actual shops, but its symbolic meaning in the town, in terms of pride and people's pride for Oldham. And so we've kind of recognised that the economy and those things fit together, and we've almost kind of taken the levelling up mantra, which is becoming, levelling up is very much focused on economic transformation and civic pride as 2 things that need to sit together. So we went through those sessions. We had some very good witnesses, I think. So we had people from all over the country come. They joined us like you're joining us now remotely, which made it a lot easier than if we'd have organised it so that everybody had to travel up. The advantage was we were able to access people who might not otherwise have been able to contribute. And I think one of the benefits of doing it the way we've done it has been that we've felt that we've had some really important insights into some of the wider debates that aren't just about Oldham, but they're about other towns like Oldham, and what therefore we and those towns might expect in terms of policy, what we can do for ourselves and what we can expect in terms of our partners too. So I think that was important. I also think it's helped us to raise the profile of the town with those people. So, you know, the fact is that if they're experts in this field and they've come to talk about Oldham, it helps us and actually helps them which is something we wanted to do. So I think that kind of explains the sessions. And Laura, is there anything you want to add before we move on?
No, all good.
Excellent. Okay, so Maddie, if we could go to the next slide then, I'll try and speed up a bit so as we go through. So this is a bit in terms of our remit. So we're not writing an economic plan. There's lots of plans. I went through them last night actually, and there's at least a dozen plans from the combined authority, and there's at least another half a dozen big plans from the council. So we have more than enough plans. We have plans on everything. But what we want to focus on is not the detail of the plans, but it's what's the direction of travel, what are we trying to get to, what are we actually trying to achieve here, and how will we know when we've done it. And it really, that's a theme I think that will come back and we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a few minutes. We wanted to make some practical recommendations about what we should be doing. And some things have come out this very quickly. There's areas I will talk about in a minute where we think it's an easy win. Okay, so so one of the things is not to be buffeted about by the short-term things, because we need a long-term focus, and we need some mechanisms that can withstand the fact that things change quite a lot. You know, you will all be aware of you know, changes in personnel, changes in people, changes in impact on different organisations, and somehow or another we've got to not be buffeted about by those things. And then really to be clear about the Oldham parts of that, what can we do better ourselves, and therefore on the basis of that, what are we asking from our Greater Manchester and national partners in terms of where the town wants to get to. So Maddie, if we could go to the next slide. Great. Okay. Now as we work through this, one of the things we really felt was at the heart of this, and I think this is going to really resonate, I hope, with many of you, is it's very difficult to talk about Oldham without confronting the really persistent and insidious problem of poverty. And there is lots going on to help, I think, improve the situation and help manage that situation. I think people mentioned when we joined the call, work around food banks and so on. We know there's a poverty strategy and so forth. We don't want to duplicate that work. That work carries on and is good. But what we're concerned about is, how is Oldham going to improve the position of people in the town who just, quite frankly, don't have enough money? And how is Oldham going to, what are the options open to the town in terms of addressing that problem over a period of time? There are no magic wands. I mean, one of the things that stands out for us is what you might call post-industrial towns like Oldham, while they're all very different, you know, Barnsley and Burnley and Oldham and Hartlepool all have their own histories and have their own differences, but they do have a common set of problems which come from the fact that their original economic purpose is gone. What made the town great in the first place, the cotton and engineering, that's gone, and it's probably not going to come back. Similarly for, you know, in the South Yorkshire coalfields, for example, the coal is gone. And the challenge then becomes, how then do you start to think about ways of replacing that? And the four things that we focused on in this review are strategies around trying to help Oldham people to have more money to spend. And so we put it in a very crude way, and it's not meant to be crude in the final thing, but we kind of focused on four areas where we think the wider strategies around the economy and skills and business and so on can start to really focus on those issues. And they might seem obvious, these things, but if they're not high in our minds when we design projects and undertake pieces of work, then they can get lost. And these are quite important disciplines, we feel, in terms of bringing us back to some core priorities. So the first issue, and there's lots of data in the labour market stuff that we looked at this, and I'm sure lots of you have seen or a lot of that, is to improve skills and upskill those who live here and help them into better jobs, either in Oldham or in neighbouring areas. We use the term neighbouring areas on purpose. It's not just in Manchester, though it is in Manchester, but it's also in other areas. And what we mean by that is really improve the overall skill level so that those who have got very low levels of qualifications currently can access better jobs, but also we don't have enough people in the town with higher levels of qualification. If you compare us to somewhere like Trafford, there's a fairly big gap between the number of people with kind of degree level skills in Oldham and a town like Trafford, and that gap is part of the challenge that we've got. So one of the things is improve skills and help people into better jobs. It's also important to attract more people to come and live in Oldham because it's a great place to live. That has transport links and housing and culture and community facilities that make it an attractive place for people to want to come to. And I'll come back to that theme in a minute because it's linked to some of the other points here. And also to attract people to come to the town centre to shop and consume here, including people that live in Oldham, but also people that don't live in Oldham. That Oldham becomes a destination that people actually want to come to. So, for example, a good example of that kind of thing would be the often discussed Altrincham Market, which a few years ago, Altrincham was not a place that people went into the town to spend their money, but the market has created a place where people from outside go in to spend their money, which benefits the traders there because they've got a wider range of people coming in. And then the fourth aspect of this was to help more Oldham businesses to grow and create more employment. Now, this is quite an important point. Two things stood out for us in this review. One was we've got some amazing businesses in Oldham. We really do. And we also have a strong track record of starting businesses. But a lot of those businesses don't succeed. And it may well be, and this is an area for further work, that one of the problems is, and we're going to test this out with the town centre traders too, that many of the people that start smaller businesses don't have a big enough market of people with disposable income to make the businesses succeed well here. And that would be a difference with an area like Altrincham, where there are people with disposable income. And so when people start businesses, they've got people who can afford to shop in them. And this is part of the way of helping people to be able to share the wealth around a bit and help people to create some better opportunities. So we've tried to focus there on a range of things that we think all amount to the same thing of how do we help people move from a position where they're very dependent on universal credit, welfare, and the town's very dependent on grants to be able to do things, to a position where that may not be quite the case. And clearly skills and business are key to that. So given that focus, if we could move on, Maddie, to the next slide. When we talked to the various witnesses, a few really important themes stood out. And I think I'd ask you to bear in mind those priorities as we talk about this. So one really clear issue that came out was the importance of having a clear view about what the end game is. What are we trying to get to? So if we take the example of Manchester, which came up very strongly in the sessions, going back to the 1980s and 1990s, Manchester was a place where it had very few places open after 8 o'clock at night. It didn't have a strong town centre in the way that it's got now. Businesses were closing and leaving Manchester rather than opening. And it's taken a very long time for them to get to the point where they are now. And it's probably not finished yet, in all honesty. But the characteristic thing has been that they set out a vision and knew where they wanted to get to. And then they kept that vision and that focus. Even as governments changed, government policies changed, and new opportunities came, they kept that sense of what they were trying to get to for their place. And that was an important theme we felt that came out for Oldham. And in practical terms, that overlaps with the second issue, which is, the big challenge for Oldham is, with the decline of manufacturing, the thing that used to provide the majority of employment in the town has gone. And manufacturing companies now, even if we brought them back, don't employ people on the scale that the BAE Systems and the other companies did in the 1980s. And one of the anecdotes, just to illustrate this, that we shared was that one of my former colleagues was a careers advisor in Oldham in the 1980s. And when he arrived in Oldham, he retired a few years ago, and he found the papers in his briefcase from when he'd started. And he said his job in the 1980s included finding 1,500 apprentices to meet the demand for engineering apprenticeships in this town. And that is less than 40 years ago. That's a whole secondary school worth of young people going into apprenticeships. We don't have 1,500 apprenticeships in Oldham anymore across every area of employment. So you can see that that issue about economic purpose is absolutely central. And the key here is that the town's purpose has changed. We've got to define therefore what it is. Now that can include being a great place to live and move to, bring up families because you know you've got good schools, a nice community, great amenities, and it's a great place to live. That's a part of that picture, but it's also got to be about, yes, but what else does the town make? What other businesses does it have that can bring money into the town? And how is the town centre and the other shopping districts, how is that an attractive place for businesses to set up and to thrive? And what's the kind of context in which that happens? So that's clearly changed, and Oldham needs to be very kind of clear about that. We've also been very clear that the private, public, and the updated slide on this does include the voluntary and community sector as a distinct sector. All of us are part of the solutions to that. But what we've got to start to see is what the interdependency of that is. So there's some important things for us. You know, I work in the semi-public sector. Lots of you will be working in the voluntary and public sectors. Having a strong private sector helps us. And it's important in terms of the contribution they bring, in terms of business rates, but also employment, but also when they're good employers, what they bring in terms of good employment, higher salaries and so on. And an example that we looked at was the company Ultimate Products, which is based in Chadderton, which I think, off the top of my head, Ruby and Laura, I think they said it's 250 jobs. They've got half of those are people from Oldham, and the salaries are all, average salaries are around £30,000 a year. So if we had a lot more companies like Ultimate Products, the town would be in a very different place, but we don't have enough of them. And therein lies a big part of the challenge for the town. And of course, what that does is mean that if we have a more mixed economy, then the weight of carrying some of the town's bigger challenges doesn't just rest on the shoulders of the council and the other partners, and we become less vulnerable to things like cuts in public spending and so on, which the town is particularly vulnerable to. Now, we recognise there's a really difficult balance between improvements for those who already live here and changing the town in a positive direction. And that's a balance that the stakeholders and partners are going to have to grapple with. What we've got to be careful of is ending up with all of our time consumed with managing the really difficult situations that we've got and trying to do our best to make a better place within the constraints we've got, but also trying to get out of that somehow. And what is very, very clear is unless Oldham has a clear vision of how that's going to happen, nobody else is going to come and do it for us. There are other priorities in Greater Manchester, there are other priorities nationally, and if we don't have that clear sense of how we want to solve these problems, then no one else will do that. So that's a really important finding. Data I've mentioned, and also the city region. What we don't want to come out with this report is a sense of Oldham and the city region being antagonistic or against each other. Oldham local authority is part of the combined authority. And the city region actually needs Oldham to do well as much as we need them to help us. Because what is really clear is the problem of Greater Manchester, like other places outside of London, is that it's not solved its economic problems well enough. It's done really well, but it's actually quite limited. If you measure the amount of tax that comes in to Greater Manchester through subsidies and welfare and public services and how much we pay back a lot less than we get, which is a characteristic feature not just of Greater Manchester, but most other places outside of London and the South East. It's one of the strange parts of our national economic kind of structure. And this exactly is what we think Levelling Up should be trying to help address. So it's the combination of how devolution might help address those problems, but also, to be clear, what we want is a dialogue with the city region where it's really clear what the benefits of being part of that city region are for the town and what the town needs to do and the partners need to do to make that happen. So we know we've got Metrolink, but there's a little bit of anxiety about, well, has it really brought any of the changes we thought it would bring? It's brought some benefits. We're actually quite, compared to the other 9 areas of Greater Manchester, we're quite well position transport-wise in many respects, but we haven't seen the huge improvement in Oldham people getting jobs in Manchester, for example. So there are challenges there that we've got to kind of dig out. And I suppose the final point is that this has got to be an open-ended learning process. So we mentioned at the beginning, we've learned a lot in our group, but we also think we need to build some partnership structures which help to share that vision and share that knowledge and build the mutual understanding of the different sectors and what we can do to improve this situation. So those are some of the common things. There's just two last slides then I'll take you through. Thank you, Maddie. So, these are some of the kind of points. We can talk about the detail of this, which I haven't clobbered you with at this point in terms of questions, but the really important thing we feel is for Oldham to be very clear about taking control of its own destiny and having a clear idea of what it wants to achieve, including how that's going to be measured. Now, we might want to discuss and debate what that means, but let's take, for example, the number of people with low skills. 10 years ago, forgive me if I don't get the numbers exactly right, but the gist of what I'm saying is right, even if the exact numbers might not be right. I think from recollection, 20% of adults in Oldham had no qualifications whatsoever, and that's now 10%. So that's good. But where do we want to be in the next 5 or 10 years? And how do we think that helps us with that wider challenge? It's important that all of our projects, whatever we do, focuses back on those challenges. So if we're building projects in the town centre, how is it helping us with that wider challenge of improving wealth, improving jobs, improving opportunities for people here? But that includes public and private partners too. And one of the key things here is to use the current strengths as the kind of template and model. So we've talked a lot about how health and education and other partners and other anchor institutions can really model out some employment practices and some procurement practices which can really set the tone for how the town wants to work in the future. And we feel there's quite a lot that can be done to tidy up the partnership working and the focus of that in terms of Oldham being in control of its own destiny. But it also needs to be clear that it's got something that it can drive the relationship with Greater Manchester. Be clear about, well, where are these jobs coming and how do Oldham people get them? Are we doing enough in the town to make sure they're equipped with the right skills? And if they are equipped with those skills, how are we bridging that gap, the physical, geographical gap and the partnership gaps to help people get into those jobs when they can live here and travel in? And vice versa, what are we asking back in terms of investment in the town to try and help with that ambition? And particularly, we think this should shape the ask from national government. Clearly, they are very, very interested in levelling up. Levelling up is going to be done through the devolved authorities, which means that Oldham becomes a subset of a bigger group of places. We have to accept that's the case. We can't, Oldham's not going to get special treatment and given everything directly itself. That might be nice if it was the case, but it's not going to happen. So Oldham must be very clear, therefore, what does levelling up mean for us? And therefore, how does it work with Greater Manchester and the government to make sure that the kind of things needed to turn towns like ours round are in those devolution deals and in those arrangements so that we don't get lost, which I think there's a feeling at the moment that sometimes we do a little bit. So, and then finally, go to the last slide. Obviously I run a college, so I have a vested interest in this, but I think one of the overriding things that really very strongly came out was the importance of skills. Enterprise is also important. We'll talk about business too. I'm sure there's people on the call want to talk about that. But improving the quality of jobs in Oldham and accessing those jobs in neighbouring areas is a big challenge. And there's a real sense that the public and voluntary agencies can lead the way in helping model that out. What we would do would never be enough to solve the problems of the town, but are we all, for example, thinking about how to design jobs that give work experience to young people and adults, create apprenticeships where we can create those opportunities, and are we thinking about designing jobs that require higher levels of skill, which then mean that we can pay people more money and be more effective in terms of what we do? Now, obviously, we want that to happen on scale, but there's no reason why some of the existing agencies and organisations can't lead the way in that. There's lots more perhaps that could be added around things that we can do better to coordinate business support and enterprise, for example. and make things a bit more transparent and get more collaboration going together. But I'll leave it at that in terms of the kind of broad direction of travel. We're still at the point of working these up into kind of really detailed kind of recommendations, but we'd really be interested in your kind of views and perspectives at this point. So I think, Maddie, we can go back to gallery view. Thank you.